All right, so in this video, what I'm going to do is break down a workflow using three tools, n8n, Notion, and OpenAI's GPT assistants, or large language models, to take a voice note and turn it into a structured journal entry. I came up with the idea for this workflow because I've built a journaling practice into my daily routines, and it's been immensely helpful to me. But one thing I've noticed is there are some days where, for whatever reason, I'm not able to find the time to sit down and actually write my journals. So one quick fix that I found is to just take out my phone whenever I'm kind of out and about on those days and take a quick voice note. And so taking voice notes like that has been really helpful, but one thing I like about journaling is that if they're all written down in the same place, I can go back and look at them. And so what this workflow aims to do is it aims to solve that problem of, on those days where I can't find the time or I don't have the ability to sit down and type out a journal entry and instead take a voice note, how can I translate that back into my written journal collection as easily and as quickly as possible so that when I go to do my review and reflection on my journal entries, all of the entries are there. So with all that said, we've got our problem well defined. Now let's start building our actual workflow. So before we start building anything, before we grab any of our tools, one thing I like to do is really make sure I understand the problem I'm trying to solve, even before I sit down and build a workflow diagram or a pseudo workflow. So I've dissected the problem here, and to get this workflow built, it seems to break into about 4 parts on the first look. The first step is we're going to capture the voice memo, and that voice memo or that voice note, the audio file itself, is going to serve as the trigger that kicks off the workflow when I add it to a certain database or a certain spot. The second piece of the problem is going to be transcribing the audio into a usable transcript. Now, I already said that I'm going to use Whisper API to do this. There are some voice note recorders that actually produce a transcript, so if you're building this and kind of building off of it, you could even grab a transcript beforehand and eliminate a step of the workflow. But I know that I'm gonna want a tool to do this for me, so this is a piece of the puzzle. The third step is going to be taking that transcript, that text transcript that we build, and structuring it into a journal entry. And that format is specific, and it's a standard format that I use. Every day I sit down to write a journal, there's a standard template that I use, so we can leverage that. And then the fourth step is going to be saving that journal entry back into my database. Again, I'm going to be using Notion, but any database will do here for this workflow. So now that we've dissected the problem, let's start building out our pseudo workflow or our workflow diagram. And this will give us a clearer picture of how to actually implement this in n8n or whatever workflow and automation tools you're using to build this. So the next step after we've identified our basic steps of the workflow is to build a workflow diagram. Sometimes I call this a pseudo workflow. In programming, there's the concept of writing pseudo code, which is basically stepping through the problem without writing any necessary functions or the actual coding language, which effectively creates like a checklist or a to-do list for the program that you're trying to write. So let's break this down. This is an expansion of the previous steps. So the first step we're going to look at is we want the voice note to be the trigger that kicks off the workflow. So the action that happens is the voice note is added and it's captured in a database. Up here, I've put the tools that I'll be using. These aren't necessary. I'll just call it that any database will do for this. I'm deciding to use Notion, but any database is really the essential tool that you're using at this point of your workflow. From there, we're going to kick off the transcription of the voice note. Again, I'm using Whisper API, but any transcription tool that you use will work for this step of the workflow. Maybe the most intricate piece of this entire flow is going to be the creation of the journal entry. That's because there's a few extra assets or artifacts that we're going to pull in here to take this step and turn it into something that really helps it get to that done state. So the assistant here that I'm going to be building is going to be tasked with creating a journal entry. The transcript is going to get parsed and structured into a journal entry that follows a given format. If you have any experience building AI assistants, you'll recognize that there are a few things that need to be done here. If you don't, that's fine. I'll show you how to implement these as we build the workflow out. But for now, all you need to know is there's 2 things you should have when you go to invoke this assistant and actually use it in your workflow. One is the system prompt that you're going to feed to the assistant. This is something along the lines of, you are a transcript editor, you're going to be given a transcript, and I would like you to put it into this format, and then give it the format. The other thing is the template or the format that it's supposed to follow. Like any good bit of prompt engineering, we want to be as specific as possible here while leaving a little bit of wiggle room for the prompt and the assistant to effectively do a better job than we can articulate to it. But we'll get into the nuance when it's time to actually build that prompt out. After that, it's pretty simple. We have the final journal entry in a text form. And so all we're going to do is take that back and we're going to save it into our database, in this case Notion. And it's going to be a nice formatted journal entry that's ready for me to take a review of, take a look at, maybe make a few edits to, and then log so that I have it in my collection of journal entries. All right, so before we start building, we have our pseudo workflow or our workflow diagram. We're aware of roughly what we need to put into the workflow to get it to work. But there are some things I want to call out here to kind of keep an eye out for as we start to build this in n8n. So the first really important factor is we're going to assume that the person who's recording the journal entry, the voice note, knows what sections they need to fill out mentally so that when they're speaking the journal entry, even if it's not in order, it contains all of the necessary elements. The second thing to consider, and this is more for maintenance of this workflow, if it actually becomes something that I use day to day, is the assistant or the assistants, probably just one to start, will have I'm calling it a cached copy of the journal format. This is because the prompt and the template will live in the assistant's instructions. And so if that structure ever changes, I need to remember to go in and actually change it in the assistant code or the assistant instructions in this case, OpenAI platform, but for whatever assistant you might use, make sure that you update it in the right spot. And then we want to make sure that it has the right status, that it updates the other voice note so it doesn't get redone and it doesn't just run infinitely. So we want to make sure that the system effectively cleans up after itself as we build this workflow. So now we're in n8n. What I have right here is the finished workflow. What we're going to do is we're going to step through it step by step or node by node, and I'm going to explain how to implement it, and I'm going to call out the sections of the workflow where you will be inputting your own data. Two things to call out here before we get into the build. The first is the actual workflow minus the final formatting for n8n is actually just this piece right here. So the build out it looks pretty darn simple and pretty much similar to how we had our pseudo workflow built. This is nice and pretty and it's nice and clean, and I think it has maybe one more or two more nodes than the actual pseudo workflow or workflow diagram did. The right half of this workflow, and n8n and Notion, this is very much if you're listening, this is just to get it into Notion. Notion has a rate limit. At the time of this recording, Notion has a rate limit or a character limit on how many tokens or characters you can input to a page or a block at a time. It's roughly I think it's 2,000. So this entire right half of the workflow is just to get around that 2,000 character limit. Really quickly, shout out to Julia Andreini, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from the n8n community. So this is pretty much a copy paste of that workflow with a few extra bits added in to make it work with my Notion and also the content that we're using. But regardless, appreciate you putting that in the community, and definitely want to make sure that you are getting credit for this right-hand side of the workflow, because this is a pesky problem for Notion users who are trying to insert stuff into pages via the API. Let's start stepping through how this works. So for now, we are going to just trigger the workflow when it's ready by clicking Test Workflow. Once we actually implement this, you can replace this node with something like a on database update. For now, though, we're just going to click the button, and that's what's going to be running the workflow when it's ready. So once we start our workflow, what we're going to do is grab some stuff out of a Notion database. So right now, actually, we're going to jump over to Notion. We're going to take a look at how the database is structured and we understand what's in it. And then we'll work through this workflow up to the point where we're sending it off to our AI assistants to get the transcription and the journal formatting done. Let's take a look at Notion. Here is our Notion database for this workflow. Pretty simple, looks almost like the standard Notion database if you just create a default database. A few things I want to call out, and then we'll jump right back into n8n. The first thing we have here is our date field. This just matches the date that the journal entry was created on. At the time that we run the workflow, we're going to grab this and make sure we use it when we put in the new journal entry to make sure that the date matches the date of the original recording and not the date that the workflow runs. Second thing, we want to have a status, so we make sure that our workflow says, hey, we want this audio file, we want to grab this entry from the database. None of these other ones we are ready to grab. So we've got three statuses. We've got transcribe, we've got review. This is for me when it's finally built to take a look at what is built, and then logged. And all that is just it's done. It's not going to get grabbed by the system. We've reviewed it. It's good to go. Next is the actual entry. For now, I'm just saying the date and then the title. This could really be anything. We're not going to use it in the workflow. I just like to have a little organization here to keep it nice and semantic. And then finally, we have as an attachment the audio file or the voice note. For now, we're just attaching this into the database from my phone or from whatever device you're using to make the recording. And we're going to grab this audio file and hand it off to the transcription. So that's it. I'm going to call out one concept here, which is an API. Our Notion API is hooked into n8n. So if you haven't done that yet, go and do a quick internet search of n8n Notion API connections. Most of the resources that come up are awesome. What you're effectively going to do is just hook your Notion into your n8n. You're going to share the database by using the share button and get that all plugged in. So once that's ready, you'll be ready to tackle the next nodes up until the AI generation. Let's go back to n8n now and look at how we're doing that with our Notion grabs and passing it along to Whisper to get transcribed. Now we're back in n8n and we're ready to start plugging some of these first nodes together. So once our workflow kicks off and we know that we have that audio file in our Notion database, we're ready to go and grab the audio file and start to pass it along to our AIs. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a Notion node that is a get database page. We want to get many of this, so any that match our criteria. For now, it's going to be one. For our test cases, it's going to be one to start. The database we want to grab, we're going to grab it from a list. Remember, you should have shared the database that you've created for this workflow with with n8n in your Notion database page. You'll select the database from this list. You can do it by ID, but I like to do it by list just because it guarantees that I'm hitting the right one. And then I'm limiting this to one for now. If you want to return all and process multiple voice note entries at the same time, you can do that and loop n8n. That's beyond the scope of this tutorial. But then we want to filter. We want to make sure we're actually filtering down the entries in that database that are ready to be transcribed. So remember, we have three statuses. One status is transcribed, the other one is review, the other one is logged. For now, we want to mark for this system that the voice notes are ready to be transcribed and formatted into journal entries by filtering by the status of transcribed. So that's all this file is. We're not going to download right now because when I was building this out, I was hitting might be a bug, might be something I was doing, where the file directly downloaded from Notion actually wasn't passable to Whisper. So I might try to troubleshoot that off screen, but for now we're going to do the file download. We're going to grab the audio file by making an HTTP request in a few nodes. For now, we're just going to grab the journal entries that we want to transcribe from our source database in Notion and get ready to pass that along. The next node in the chain, we're going to grab another Notion node and we're going to get a database page. All we're doing here is grabbing the specific database page that is ready to be transcribed. And what we can do is we can start testing at this point to make sure we're actually getting the right stuff. So let's go ahead and test this step, see what comes up. We'll see if I've broken anything in the meantime. And it looks like we are good and all set here. We're grabbing the database correctly. That's coming back positive. And now we're ready to start grabbing the database page by the ID of the journal entry that we want to transcribe. This sounds fancy, but really all we're doing here is just making sure that in that database that we just looked at in Notion, we're going and grabbing the right entry in the database or the right row that says transcribe. It has a file, and we're ready to grab that file and download it to transcribe to like a structured text journal entry. In this field, what we have here is we've got our URL to go and grab the file. Again, originally I was passing this directly to OpenAI's Whisper API, and for whatever reason, it was not reading it incorrectly. So simple fix for that, we're just going to use an HTTP request node. We're going to use the property data from, we're going to use this header or this field from our Notion database to hand in the URL, and we're going to say just go and get this file as a binary stream, grab it, download it, and get ready to pass it along. So we tested it. I had to stop the workflow. But what it did is it went and grabbed from this URL, it went and grabbed the data and the file, which is now ready to use as a binary stream within our workflow. Again, binary stream sounds technical. Really, it's just machine code that can be inputted into another node so that it's readable as a file format like an audio file .mp3, .mp4, and can be understood by the next node in the chain. It's just a file format. Think about it like that. So we've gotten through the first bit of our workflow. We now have our audio file ready to use. What we're going to do now is we're going to hand it off to OpenAI's Whisper API, and we're going to transcribe it. So the setup for this is pretty straightforward. All you need to do, and this is another pause point if you have not yet hooked up an OpenAI API key with your n8n instance, all you need to do is go into OpenAI, grab the API key, hook it in here, and do that. There's plenty of great tutorials online to do that. So if you haven't done that yet, it's a great point to pause the video and come back once that's done. Once you've hooked in your API key, you can grab a transcription node from the n8n node palette, and you can hook up the API key that you've created. You want to make sure that it knows we're passing in an audio resource because that binary stream that we grabbed from the previous node, remember that HTTP download, that was a download of an audio file binary stream. And then we're going to transcribe it. Something to call out here, which I didn't know when I started building this, is OpenAI limits the number of, or the size of the file that you can upload for transcription to 25 megabytes. In this case, the voice notes are pretty short. They're at most maybe 10 minutes. So 25 megs is pretty hard to hit with an audio file, especially if it's a compressed audio file. But something to be aware of if you start getting error cases, if your file that you're using ends up being too big, you should have the file size in your n8n and be able to see how big of an upload you're giving to this node. So if it's above 25 megs, that's why it's erroring, or that might be one of the reasons why it's erroring. Make sure that our input data field matches here. Data is our output field from the previous node, so input is going to be data. And what we're going to do here is we're going to test this, and what it's doing in the background is it's going off, it's sending this audio file, or binary, off to OpenAI's Whisper API. That API is going to grab the audio, it's going to transcribe it, and it should return the transcription. So let's see if that works right now. It was working previously, so if it breaks here, I got to go troubleshoot it. It's going to take a second to transcribe. And beautiful, we have our output of our transcription. Now we have the transcript in text form, and we're ready to start formatting it. So if we remember back to our pseudo workflow or our workflow diagram, this is where we're going to have a few other assets to build to plug in to our OpenAI assistant, our GPT assistant, that's going to help us take this transcript and format it into the journal structure. So let's take a second, let's jump back into our mockups and take a look at what the prompt format should be and what the journal format should be, and then we'll jump into OpenAI and we'll build the assistant to then come back here and use it in the workflow. Okay, so we're back in our wireframe mockup document, and let's just take another quick glance at the actual stuff we have to build for this step of the workflow. The first thing we have is we know we need our journal template. Because we are going to provide or create a standard output, the journal is going to look the same every day, we should provide a template to the assistant to make sure it knows how to format the output. The other thing we need to build now is our journal prompt. What this is our system instruction that goes to the assistant at the time that the workflow calls it to be run. And it says, hey, this is your kind of role within these parameters. Follow these instructions, use the provided data, and output something that we want. So that's the pseudo workflow or the workflow diagram. Now let's take a look at these two assets, build them, and then put them into our assistant in OpenAI so that they're ready to use in our workflow. All right, so the simpler part of this is going to be our journal template. This is the template that I built for this workflow, and this is pretty close to the template that I just use day to day. So what we have here is just the standard outline of what the journal looks like. We have a section for gratitude, top 3 priorities, reflection, and then lessons learned from the previous day. Now, this is a piece of the workflow that you can and should modify to fit your needs, right? If you have a journaling practice or you want to start journaling, what are some pieces that you want to include in your journal every day? Now, the more nuanced piece of this is building the prompt to hand to the assistant that we're going to call from the workflow so that it knows what its job is, what to do, and what output to provide. So I'm going to talk through this. I'm going to read it exactly as it is. This is something that may be a newer format to you if you haven't built a lot of workflows before that invoke an AI or use system prompts. I've tried to follow some best practices here, like using XML tags to tell the prompt or tell the assistant when I'm going to give it structured data so that it can break it up and have a sense of where it is in the prompt and how to organize the output. So the assistant prompt that we've gone with is, you are an expert transcript editor. I'm giving it a role. Your task is to take any provided voice note transcript, editing and formatting it to match the journal template below. The transcript will be provided to you in XML tags as transcript, that's an XML tag. The journal entry template below is wrapped in XML tags as template. If any elements of the journal entry are missing from the transcript, please note them in the entry as not included in the original voice note. Under no circumstances are you to invent, create, or hallucinate topics and elements of the original transcript that aren't there. This piece is specifically so that it doesn't invent stuff to make a complete output. If it doesn't exist, it should just say it wasn't included in the voice note, and that way it's not creating things in the transcript that aren't there. It doesn't guarantee it, but it does guard against it. Also, never include XML tags in your final output. And then below, I have the template, and you're going to recognize this from the journal template that we just created. All this is just a markdown formatted list of exactly what we've already built. And it's wrapped in XML tags to note to the assistant, hey, this piece of your prompt, this is the template that I just defined and described above. So now that we have these two artifacts, let's go and plug them into an assistant, and then we'll work back to n8n so we can implement them in our workflow and start getting our structured output. Okay, so now let's quickly just take those two artifacts, place them into our OpenAI assistant that we've created, and then we'll jump back into n8n. So what I've done here is I've created an assistant within my project for this workflow, and I've inserted the system instructions that we just defined. So to take another quick look at those, here's what they are. This looks identical to what I just read out in our mockups and wireframes. You are an expert transcript editor, ... Same instructions. The template is provided with XML, so let's save that. We're going to use 4o as our model here. You can use any model you like. You don't even have to use OpenAI models. You can use something like Claude or another Anthropic AI. All we're doing here is just giving those assets to an assistant so that we can call it when it comes time to in n8n. No additional things here. We don't need to do a file search. We don't need to do a code interpretation. Really simple assistant. All it's doing is going to grab the transcript that's provided, and it's going to output it in a format that matches the template we've provided it. Once you've got this built, make sure that it's saved to the right dashboard or saved to the right project in your OpenAI platform, and then go and plug it in n8n. That's what we're going to go do right now. Let's quickly recap what we've done so far because it's not insignificant. We've done quite a bit so far, even though it seems simple, or it might seem simple. So once we hit go on our workflow, we're grabbing the database. We're grabbing the items from the database that we want to download the voice note file from and get ready to transcribe. And then we're handing it to OpenAI's Whisper API to transcribe and provide to an assistant to be formatted into our final journal entry. So now that we have those steps checked off, it's time to actually use our assistant that we've built to take the transcript and format it into our final journal entry. So let's open this up and look at how to put it together. We want to grab an assistant as our resource once we're plugged into our OpenAI project. And we're going to message our assistant. Now our assistant here is our voice to journal transcript editor that we created in the OpenAI dashboard. And again, from our list, we can just select this. You can do ID or stuff like that too. But again, I like to just select it from the list because that gives me as close to perfect confidence as I can have that it's the right assistant that we're invoking. Now, two options when you go to define your prompt. You can grab the output of the previous node automatically, or you can define your prompt manually or semi-manually. I've opted for defining the prompt manually, simply because if you remember back to our prompt, the assistant is expecting the transcript to be wrapped in transcript XML tags. And while that might seem like a small thing, to the prompt and to the assistant, it tells it this begins the transcript and this ends the transcript. If you have any experience writing code or things like HTML, the same way that you say, hey, this is the opening part of a div, this is the closing part of a div, it's exactly like that. While it's a small addition to the raw output of the previous node, it is guaranteeing that the assistant is seeing the transcript in the right context. And so all we've done here is we've created the XML tags by typing them in, and then we've taken the previous output and we've inserted it as just a variable of JSON text. And as a reminder, you can drag and drop within n8n. So if it's a little hard to figure out how to type this or you're not fully used to the n8n markup yet, just drag and drop, and then you can add the rest of the stuff around it, right? So in this case, if we wanted to build this from scratch, we could drag and drop the text from the previous node, and then we could go in here and, in the wrong order, just type in, and now we have it wrapped in XML tags, and it'll dynamically show what the actual input will be based on the previous node's output. So now what we can do is we can test this step. We can make sure that our assistant works as expected, and that's exactly what we're going to do right now. Let's go ahead and test this. So it's got its transcript, and it should provide a structured output that looks exactly like our journal template. We're pretty darn close to it. Awesome. So it's done it. This is really the end of the workflow, so to say, aside from getting it into our Notion database. We have the content, which was the input, and we have the output. And what we have here is, it's a little bit hard to read. We have a markdown structured journal entry, which is ready to go into our Notion database. So the rest of the workflow is really just saving it to Notion. I'll walk through the basic steps. If you want a video in the future on how to do all of this, let me know in the comments. Also, I'm going to take a second to point you to, if you just want a solution and you want to just grab the code yourself, go ahead and check out the n8n community post. Here's the link. I'll drop it in the description of this video as well so that you have access to it. It's going to look a lot like this. It's really just a, if the input is over 2,000 characters, break it up, loop over the input, and deposit it into your Notion page in 2,000 character chunks. If it's not, just build the page right away. So what we have here is on the top half of our screen, we have our completed n8n workflow. On the bottom half of the screen, we have our Notion database with our source audio file in it, and we are ready to test this and see if it completely and fully works. So if this workflow runs successfully, in the bottom half of the screen, we'll see another row pop up as our journal entry with the correct date on it and the correct status, etc. And then we'll also see the source file or the source entry update to a status to make sure it doesn't get run again. And what that is this Notion node here is just calling when the rest of the workflow finishes, and it's saying, hey, go back to the original database and update the entry that you've been pulling from to make sure that it doesn't get updated again or it doesn't get called again by the same workflow. So it's cleaning up after itself. Let's go ahead and click run on this. So it's sending off to the AI transcription right now, the Whisper API. That's done. Now the editor has it. It's going to format it to our liking. And the final output is less than 2,000 characters, so it didn't need to run the rest of the workflow. It's just created a new page, added it to the database, and added the content of the previous node's output. And so in our source database, we have a successful update. We've got 2 entries now. We've got a new entry with content in it, and then our source entry has been logged. So the next time I run this, it shouldn't run anything. It's done because it's looking at the status of the original entries in the database, and there's nothing that says, hey, it's ready to transcribe. So it just says, cool, I'm done. The original entry is going to look exactly the same. We haven't touched any of the data. And then here, we've got our journal entry. So from the voice note that we had, what are 3 things I'm grateful for? I'm grateful for the Notion workflow I'm building, the ability to get these thoughts down in video, and of course, I'm grateful for people who click the like and subscribe button. Top 3 priorities for today. hook into the Notion database and n8n. And remember, this is all based on the transcription, so it's gotten proper nouns right, which is why I like using the Whisper API as opposed to like some of the built-in transcription tools. It does a really good job of getting proper nouns down. Do some more journaling to get the journal backlog entries into the Notion database and get a good night's sleep. Reflection, challenges, etc., and lessons learned. That's our journal entry. And the source audio file was maybe 3 minutes long, and we ran that in a lot less time than it would take for me to sit and transcribe stuff and get it right and into the structure. So that saved us maybe 5-10 minutes, but it's really just for one journal entry. If you have a backlog of 50 journal entries, or you have longer journal entries, then it could save you 30 minutes, an hour, or more. So this is working as expected. I think we're going to call this done. And let's take a second now to review some of what we learned, take a look at maybe some stuff that we could implement in a next version, and then we'll wrap up by just going over kind of the key stuff from this video, and we'll call this one done. I've taken a second and I've written down some stuff that may be useful to kind of work into this workflow as I work to improve it. So a few things for the version 2, right? One question that we can ask is this transcription accurate with different types of voice recordings? So what we can start to do here is ask, okay, what if the person recording the voice note doesn't know the structure of the voice note ahead of time? How can we change the prompt to be more accepting of different speaking styles, different structures, additional information that falls outside the structure? And so one thing we can do to improve this is make the system prompt and the template more robust in that way. Another thing we can do is we can make sure we update the assistant as we go so it doesn't invent sections or hallucinate if the source voice note doesn't have all the parts. We haven't tested that yet, but that's certainly something we can test on our next iterations of, hey, if I don't include things I'm grateful for in my journal entry, but there's a spot for it, does the assistant correctly fill that in with, this was not in the source transcript, therefore it's not here. Another thing we can play around with, and certainly might make it easier to get stuff into the system and the workflow, is playing around with what triggers the system. So right now, I'm assuming that it's going to be based on just updates to a Notion database, but maybe it's easier for me if I'm recording a voice note in WhatsApp or a Slack channel or a Discord, looking at different ways that the workflow could get kind of triggered and started that may be more useful for me when I'm out and about and it's like, oh man, I've got 3 minutes to record a voice note that I want to do as my journal entry today, but all I've got access to, I don't have time to filter it into Notion and all that. Let me just, do it as a WhatsApp voice note or drop the file into a Slack channel or a Discord channel or something like that. Another area of improvement that is definitely available is make the markdown formatting look better. So right now the workflow is outputting journal entry in markdown format, but when it gets into Notion, Notion isn't correctly reading that format. So either generating a markdown file and just inserting it into the database, or working on some sub workflow that will help make that markdown format prettier, etc., etc. And then looking at ways that we could make the process even stronger than if I was just sitting and journaling by myself, we might do some things like adding a sentiment analysis of, hey, based on the speaker, based on the language used, and maybe even the tone of voice, take a guess at the person's mood or how they're feeling, or maybe what's on their mind, what's weighing more heavily. Some other things we could integrate too is, hey, for the action items, the things that are high priority, do a little bit of a feasibility analysis. Are these things that are actually doable in a day, right? If I sit down and say my top 3 priorities are to run a marathon, eat 10,000 calories, and sleep 16 hours, maybe not the most doable day. So that's something we can build into the prompt, and maybe a secondary assistant to say, you've got this journal entry, now add on to it in a way that helps me kind of take a better analysis and review of my day. I've brought us back to our workflow diagram here because this is a really good way of checking if the end workflow is actually what we wanted to build in the first place. Remember early on I said that part of the reason for building this workflow diagram is to make sure we don't build something that we don't want or need to build. So what we're going to do now is just take a quick look and say, have we checked all these boxes? So do we have a voice note trigger or anything that kicks off the workflow? Right now it's just me clicking the button, but we could pretty quickly implement a way for the Notion database to check and say, hey, I've been updated. Let's go ahead and start this workflow if there are any things in here that need to be transcribed. So yes, we've definitely satisfied this part of the workflow. Have we transcribed the voice note? Absolutely. We called the Whisper API. We grabbed the information that came back from it and we passed it along. We did that by hooking into OpenAI's API, and we passed the download of the audio file, and then we got the text of that transcription as an output. So yes, absolutely, we've done this. Have we used an assistant to create a journal entry? Well, to do that, we had to make sure we had a journal prompt and we had to have our template for the actual output that we wanted to create. So we have our template, we have that structured result, and we have the system prompt, which is that piece of instruction that says you are a transcript editor, ... Here's what to do, here's what not to do. Try to structure your output always in this way, etc., etc. So we have those 2 assets for sure, and that's all we ended up needing to build. And then from there, we were able to build our assistant using 4.0 in this case, but this could be any assistant that accepts these 2 artifacts. So this assistant can create the journal entry, and what we get is it receives the text input of the transcript and it outputs the structured journal entry. So yes, absolutely, we've checked this box. And then the final piece, a small but important piece for my workflow and anybody who's using Notion to track their journals, is it saving back into Notion? And while we kind of skimmed over the implementation of that, because that's maybe the topic for another video, yes, it is grabbing the output and it's able to put it back into a Notion database using a little bit of complicated work based on the size of the journal entry, but absolutely it's doing it. And so we have completed this workflow, which is awesome. And that's not any small thing. It's cool to see that we're able to call APIs. We've done a bit of prompt engineering and we've done some good templating here. And then the transcription to journal flow works. And so really, as a version 1, this workflow is done. All right, so that is our workflow all done. We have built it, tested it, made sure it's working in its most basic cases, and we've even done a little bit of thinking on what could be improved once we go back in to make the workflow better. Now, one thing I would love to hear from you is how would you improve this workflow? I've got my own ideas as to things I could add that would make it more useful to me, but if you were building this for yourself or maybe following along throughout the video, how would you make this more useful to you? Go ahead and drop that down in the comments wherever you're watching this. And also, if you have any feedback or constructive criticism as to things I could do better in these videos, I'm always looking to make them more useful to you and other viewers. So please feel free to drop those in the comments as well. So once again, my name is Jamie. I'm feeling really good about where this workflow is at. So we're going to call this one done and dusted. Looking forward to speaking with some of you in the comment section. And otherwise, I will see you in the next one.